Expecting Someone Taller by Tom Holt. Chapter 5. One of the things that slightly worried Malcolm was the fact that he was becoming decidedly middle-aged. For example, the rich light drinking of afternoon tea had come to mean a lot to him, not simply because it disposed of an hour's worth of daylight. He had chosen 4:30 in the afternoon as the best time for reading the daily papers, and from 4:30 to 5:30, occasionally 5:45, each day he made himself feel that he enjoyed being extremely nice and bored stiff, for he knew that all the good news that filled the papers was, in one way or another, his doing. Today there was any amount of good news from around the world. Malcolm could sense the frustration and despair of the editors and journalists as they forced themselves to report yet more bumper harvests, international accords, and miraculous cures. Admittedly, there had been a freak storm in Germany, banner headlines in the tabloids, and some crops had been damaged in a few remote areas. Nevertheless, he noted with satisfaction this minor disaster was not entirely a bad thing, since it had prompted the EEC to draft and sign a new agreement on compensating farmers for damage caused by acts of God. So, every cloud, however small, had a silver lining, although these days it was beginning to look as though only a very few silver linings had clouds. Malcolm tried to work out what could have caused the freak storm in the first place. He picked up the Daily Mirror, German farmers in rain horror, and observed that the storm had started at 3 o'clock their time, which was 2 o'clock our time, which was when Malcolm's new secretary had finally managed to corner him and force him to sign 5 letters. He resolved to be more patient with her in the future and not call her a what's-its-name under his breath. His tea was stone cold, but that did not matter. It was, after all, only him. That was a marvellous phrase, and one that he had come to treasure. When one has suddenly been forced into the role of the man of sorrows, self-pity is the only luxury that remains. In fact, Malcolm had no objection whatsoever to taking away the sins of the world, but it was useful to keep an option on self-pity just in case it came in useful later. He poured the cold tea onto the lawn and watched it soak into the ground. In the crabapple tree behind him, a robin perched and sang excitedly, but he ignored it, closing his mind to its persistent chirping. He had found that the little birds liked to come up to him and confide their secrets that they could not share with other birds, and at first he had found this extremely flattering. But since the majority of these confidences were extremely personal and of interest only to a trained biologist, he had decided that it would be best not to encourage them. After a while, the robin stopped singing and went away. Malcolm rose to his feet and walked slowly into the house. Combe Hall was undoubtedly very beautiful, but it was also very big. It had been built in the days when a householder tended to feel claustrophobic if he could not accommodate at least one infantry regiment, including the band, in his country house. Its front pediment was world famous. Its windows had been praised and reviled in countless television series. Its kitchens were enormous and capable of being put to any use except the convenient preparation of food. It was very grand, very magnificent, and very empty. Malcolm had always fancied living at Combe Hall on the strict understanding that his wish was never to come true. Now that he was its owner and, apart from the legion of staff, its only resident, he felt rather like a bewildered traveller at an international airport. The house was bad enough, but the staff were truly awful. There was no suave, articulate butler and no pretty parlourmaids. Instead, Malcolm found himself employing an army of grimly professional contract cleaners and an incomprehensible Puerto Rican cook, whom he was sure he was shamelessly exploiting in some way he could not exactly understand. After a week, Malcolm left them all to it and retreated to one of the upstairs drawing rooms, which he turned into a nicely squalid bedsit. As a result, he felt under no obligation to assume the role of country gentleman. With the house had come an enormous park and some rather attractive gardens, into which Malcolm hardly dared go for fear of offending the gardeners and the home farm. Ever since he could remember, Malcolm had listened to the archers on the radio, not from choice, but because they'd always been there in his childhood, and so had become surrogate relatives, and his mental picture of agriculture had been shaped by this influence. But the farm that he owned, now there was a thought, whirred and purred with machines and clicked and ticked with computers, filling its owner with fear and amazement. Yet, when he suggested to the farm manager that the whole thing might perhaps be rearranged on more picturesque lines and to hell with the profits, which nobody really needed, the farm manager stared at him as if he were mad. Since then, he'd kept well away from it. But with his new property came certain inelucutable responsibilities, the most arduous of which was coping with his new secretary. On the one hand, the woman was invaluable, for she ran the place and left him alone for most of the time. Without the irritations and petty nuisances of everyday life to contend with, he could keep his temper and make the maize grow tall all over Africa. But for this freedom from care, he had to pay a severe price. His secretary, who was American and in her mid-40s, had clearly made a resolution to be more English than anyone else in the history of the world. Her convert's passion for all things English gave her the zeal of a missionary, and it was obvious that she intended to anglicise young Herr Finger if it killed her. And, like many missionaries, she was not above a little persecution in the cause of the communication of enlightenment. Apart from avoiding his staff and his secretary and anything else that might tend to irritate or annoy, however, Malcolm found that he had very little to do. Even as a small boy, he had never had a hobby of any kind, and he had always found making friends as difficult as doing jigsaw puzzles, and even less rewarding. As for the comfort and solace of his family, Malcolm knew only too well that that was out of the question. If, by some miracle, he could persuade his kin to believe this ludicrous tale of rings and badges, he knew without having to think about it what their reaction would be. "Malcolm," his mother would say, "give that ring back to Bridget this instant," the implication being that it had been meant for her all along. Not that the possibility had not crossed his mind. Surely, he had reflected, his talented and universally praised sister would make a far better job of all this than he would. She had 5 A-levels and had been to Warwick University, but somehow he felt sure that Bridget was not the right person for the job. For a start, she did not suffer fools gladly, and since a large percentage of the people of the world are fools, it was possible she might not give them the care and consideration they needed. Throughout its history, Malcolm reflected, the ring had been in the possession of gifted, talented, exceptional people, and look what had happened. One morning, when Malcolm was listening, rather proudly, to the morning news, the English Rose, as he had mentally christened her, came hammering on his door. She seemed to have an uncanny knack of knowing where he was. She informed him that the annual Coombe show was to be held in the grounds of the hall in a fortnight's time. Malcolm, who loathed all such occasions from the bottom of his heart, tried to protest, but without success.
"Oh, but I've been talking to the folks from the village, and they all say it's the social event of the year,"
buzzed the Rose.
"It's one of the oldest surviving fairs in the country, according to the records I consulted."
Malcolm saw that there was no hope of escape. His secretary, apart from having the persistence of a small child in pursuit of chocolate, was an outstanding example of true ancestor worship, although it was not her own ancestors that she worshipped. Her name was Weinberger, and anything remotely traditional went to her head like wine. In fact, Malcolm was convinced if she could revive the burning of witches, with all its attendant 17th century pageantry, she probably would. But will it not now? Will it? How is it in English? A great nuisance to arrange? He suggested. That was, of course, the wrong thing to say. The Rose thrived on challenges.
"Herr Finger,"
she said, looking at him belligerently over the top of her spectacles,
"that is not my attitude, and well you know it. It will be truly rewarding for me to make all the necessary social arrangements for the proposed event, and Mr. Ayres, who is the chairman of the show committee, will be calling on you to discuss all the practicalities. There will be the usual livestock competition, of course, and I presume that the equestrian events will follow their customary pattern. I'd hope we might prevail upon the committee to revive the Jacobean sheriff's races, but Mr. Ayres has, at my request, performed a feasibility study and feels that such a revival could not be satisfactorily arranged in the limited space of time left to us before the show. So I fear that we will have to content ourselves with a Jim Connor situation.
Although Malcolm had acquired the gift of tongues from the blood of the giant, he still had occasional difficulty in understanding his secretary's English. The name Ayres, however, was immediately recognisable. It was a name he was only too familiar with. Indeed, he knew virtually all the words in the language that rhymed with it, for Liz Ayres was the girl he loved. Mr. William Ayres, the chairman of the Shore Committee, was her father, and a nastier piece of work never read a Massey Ferguson catalogue. But the thoughts of malice or resentment were no longer available to Malcolm, and so finally he agreed. The English rose scuttled away, no doubt to flick through Debrett. After Sir Walter Elliot, she was its most enthusiastic reader, and Malcolm resigned himself to another meeting with possibly his least favourite person in the world. William Ayres could trace his ancestry back to the early 15th century. His namesake had won the respect of his betters at the Battle of Agincourt by throwing down his longbow and pulling a fully armed French knight off his horse with his bare hands. The present William Ayres undoubtedly had the physical strength to emulate his ancestor's deed, and given his unbounded ferocity, would probably relish the opportunity to try. So massively built was he that people who met him for the first time often wondered why he bothered with tractors and the like on his sprawling farm at the top of the valley. Surely he could save both time and money by drawing the plough himself, if necessary, with his teeth. Compared to his two sons, however, Mr. Ayres was a puny but sunny-tempered dwarf, and Malcolm could at least console himself with the reflection that he would not be confronted with Joe or Mike Ayres at this unpleasant interview. Malcolm decided that in order to face Mr. Ayres, it would be necessary for him to be extremely German, for his antagonist had strong views about rich foreigners who bought up fine old houses in England.
"It's a tremendously important occasion," said Mr. Ayres. "One of the high points of the year in these parts. It's been going on for as long as I can remember, certainly, when Colonel Booth's still at the Hall."
Mr. Ayres was a widower, and Malcolm toyed with the idea of introducing him to the English Rose. They would have so much in common.
"I am most keen on your English traditions, naturally. Let us hope that we can make this a show to be remembered."
Mr. Ayres winced slightly. He disliked the German race, probably because they had thoughtlessly capitulated before he'd been old enough to get at them during the war.
"Then perhaps you would take care to invite some of the local people to the Hall," he replied. "It would be a splendid opportunity for you to get to know your neighbours."
"Delighted, das ist sehr gut." Mr. Ayres did not like the German language either. "Aber who shall I invite? I am not yet well acquainted with the local folk."
"Leave that to me," said Mr. Ayres. "I'll send you a list, if you like."
He drank his tea brutally. Everything he did, he seemed to do brutally.
"It'll be a good show this year, especially Jim Connor."
"What is Jim Connor?" Malcolm asked innocently. "In my country, we have no such word."
"So I believe,"
said Mr. Ayres, who had suspected as much from the start. He did his best to explain, but it was not easy. Anyone would have difficulty in explaining such a basic and fundamental concept, just as it would be difficult to explain the sun to a blind man. In the end, he was forced to give up the struggle.
"I'll get my daughter to explain it to you," he said brightly. "She and her fiancé, they haven't announced it yet, but it'll be any day now. I expect they'll be taking part in the main competition. And far be it from me, but I think they're in with a good chance. Well, not Liz, perhaps, but young Wilcox, that's her fiancé."
Malcolm fought hard to retain his composure, and as he struggled, light earth tremors were recorded in California. For all that he had never expected anything to come of his great love for Elizabeth Ayres, the news that she was soon to be engaged and married made him want to break something. Fortunately for the inhabitants of San Francisco, he managed to get a grip on himself.
"Ah, that is good,"
he said mildly. "So you will make the necessary arrangements with my secretary, yes? So charmed to have met you. Auf Wiedersehen."
"Good day, Mr. Finger."
Mr. Ayres stood up for a moment, blotting out the sun, and extended an enormous hand. Malcolm cringed as he met it with his own. He had shaken hands with Mr. Ayres once before, and was convinced that the farmer's awesome grip had broken a small bone somewhere. To his surprise, however, he was able to meet the grip firmly and without serious injury, and he suddenly realised that his arm, the arm of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, give or take a bit, was as strong or possibly stronger. This made him feel a little better, but not much. As soon as Mr. Ayres had gone, Malcolm sat down heavily and relieved his feelings by tearing up a newspaper. They hadn't announced it yet, but it would be any day now. Soon there would be a coy paragraph in the local paper, followed by a ceremony at the beautiful church with a possibly Saxon font, then a reception at the Blue Boar, the car park full of Range Rovers, champagne flowing freely, just this once, and minced up fish on tiny biscuits, and so the line of the Boarmen of Agincourt would force its way on into the 21st century. Fortune, Malcolm suddenly remembered, can make vile things precious. Like all her family, Liz was obsessed with horses. It might yet be a gymkhana to remember. When the day came, the drive of Combe Hall resembled a plush armoured column, so crowded was it with luxury four-wheel drive vehicles. Large women in hats and large men in blazers, most of whom Malcolm had last seen making nuisances of themselves at the auction rooms in Taunton, strolled through the garden, apparently oblivious of the scowls of the gardeners, or peered through the windows of the house to see what atrocities its new foreign owner had perpetrated. Malcolm, dressed impeccably and entirely unsuitably in a dark grey suit and crocodile shoes, courtesy of the Tarnhelm, Vorsprung durch Technik, as they say on the Rhine, was making the best job he could of being the shy, charming host, while the English Rose was having the time of her life, introducing him to the local gentry. He had provided, rather generously, he thought, a cold collation on the lawn for all the guests on Mr. Ayres' list, which they had devoured down to the last sprig of parsley, apparently unaware of the maxim that there is no free lunch. When the last strand of flesh had been stripped off the last chicken leg, the guests swept like a Tweed river into the park, where the show was in full swing. A talentless band made up of nasty old men and surly children were playing loudly, but not loudly enough to drown the high-pitched gabble of the quality, as deafening and intimidating as the buzzing of angry bees. There were innumerable overweight farm animals in pens, inane sideshows, vintage traction engines, and a flock of sheep who politely but firmly ignored the efforts of a number of sheepdogs to make them do illogical things. All as it should be, of course, and the centrepiece of this idyll was the shore jumping. As he surveyed his gentry-mottled grounds, Malcolm was ambushed by the Ayres clan, William, Michael, Joseph, and of course Elizabeth. He was introduced to the two terrifying brothers, who rarely made any sound in the presence of their father, and to the daughter of the family. A beautiful girl, Miss Ayres, about 5'3", light brown hair, very blue eyes, and a smile you could read small print by. Malcolm, whose mind controlled the world, smiled back, displaying the dragon slayer's geometrically perfect teeth. The two brightest smiles in the world, more dazzling than any toothpaste advertisement, and all this for politeness' sake. Malcolm managed to stop himself shouting, "Look, Liz, it's me, only much better looking," and listened attentively as the girl he loved desperately in his nebulous but wholehearted way explained to him, as by rote, the principles of the gymkhana. To this explanation Malcolm did not listen, for he was using the power he had gained by drinking giant's blood to read her thoughts. It was easily done, and with the exception of one or two of his school reports, Malcolm had never read anything so discouraging. For although the Tarnhelm had made him the most handsome man in the world, it was evident that Miss Ayres did not judge by appearances. For Liz was wondering who this boring foreigner reminded her of. Now who was it? Ah, yes, that Malcolm Fisher. He smiled, wished the family good luck in the arena, and walked swiftly away. When he was sure no one was watching, he turned himself into an apple tree and stood for a moment in one of his own hedges, secure in the knowledge that the apple trees cannot weep. But even apple trees can have malicious thoughts, ask any botanist, and if the consequences for the world were unfortunate, then so be it. One of Malcolm's few remaining illusions had been shattered. He had always believed that his total lack of attractiveness to the opposite sex was due simply to his unprepossessing appearance, a shortcoming, as he argued, that was in no respect his fault, so that his failure in this field of human endeavour reflected badly not on him, but on those who chose to make such shallow and superficial judgments. The natural consequence of the destruction of this illusion was that Malcolm wanted very much to do something nasty and spiteful, and he wanted to do it to Philip Wilcox, preferably in front of a large number of malicious people. He shrugged his branches, dislodging a blackbird, and resumed his human shape. Thanks to the blood of the giant Ingolf, Malcolm could understand all language and forms of speech, even the curious noises coming out of the tannoy. The competitors in the main event were being asked to assemble in the collecting ring. With the firm intention of turning himself into a horsefly and stinging Philip Wilcox's horse at an appropriate moment, Malcolm made his way up to the arcade of horse boxes that formed a temporary mews under the shade of a little copse in the west corner of the park. He recognised the Wilcox family horse box, which was drawn up at the end of the row. There was the horse, just standing there. An idea, sent no doubt by the Lord of the Flies, suddenly came into Malcolm's mind. How would it be if... No one was watching. The attention of the whole world seemed to be focused on a fat child in jodhpurs and his long-suffering pony. Malcolm made himself invisible, and with extreme apprehension, for he was terrified of horses, he led Philip Wilcox's steed out of its box and into the depths of the tangled copse, where he tied it securely to a tree. Then, with his nails pressed hard into the palms of his hands, he changed himself into an exact copy of the animal and transported himself back to the horse box. This would be hard work, but never mind. "And have you met the new owner?" asked Aunt Marjorie, settling herself comfortably on a straw bale. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when a foreigner—" "Just for a few minutes," replied Liz Ayres. She had learnt over the years the art of separating the questions from the comments in her aunt's conversation, and slipping in answers to them during pauses for breath and other interruptions. "What's he like? The trouble with most Germans, I don't know. He seemed pleasant enough, in a garrulous sort of way, but I only said a few words to him." "Well, I suppose we should all be very grateful to him for letting us put a water jump in the middle of his park. Not that I imagine he minds anyway, or he wouldn't have. Colonel Booth never let us have one, but he was just plain difficult at times. I remember. I don't think he's terribly interested in the whole, actually." Liz wondered if Aunt Marjorie had ever finished a sentence of her own free will in her life. Probably not. "I'm told he doesn't do anything. He just stays indoors all day. Daddy said... Oh, look, there's Joe." Elizabeth Eyre's loyalties were sadly divided in the jump-off for the main event, since the two competitors most likely to win it were her brother Joe and her fiancé. Joe was the better rider, but Philip's horse seemed to have found remarkable form just at the right moment. Only last week, Philip had been talking of selling it. Perhaps it had been listening. At times it seemed almost human, for today it was sailing over the jumps like a harrier. Even Aunt Marjorie, who in matters of shore jumping was a firm believer in entropy, had admitted that the animal wasn't too bad. "My money's on your boyfriend," said Aunt Marjorie. "What's that horse of his called? It's playing a blinder today, almost as if it understood." She had a point there. Intelligence, so Philip had always maintained, had never been one of old Mayfair's attributes. Any animal capable of taking a paper bag or rusting Minnie for a pack of wolves and acting accordingly was unlikely ever to win Mastermind, and this lack of mental as opposed to physical agility had prompted one of Philip's brightest sayings. Even if you led Mayfair to water, he would say, it probably wouldn't even occur to him to drink. But today Mayfair hadn't put a foot wrong in any sense. "Mr. Joseph Ayres and Moonbeam," said the tannoy. A hush fell over the crowd, for it seemed wrong that Joe should be riding the horse instead of the other way around. Joe was obviously the stronger of the two, just as Moonbeam was clearly the more intelligent. Aunt Marjorie, who was, like so many of her class, a sort of refined centaur, leaned forward and fixed her round, bright eyes on horse and rider. "Look at his knees," she muttered. "Just look at them." Joe did his best, but the consensus of opinion was that his best was not going to be enough. 12 faults, said the tannoy, and Aunt Marjorie shook her head sadly. "Why wasn't that idiot using a martingale?" she said. "When I was a girl—" "Excuse me," said one of the three rather pretty girls who had just made their way to the front.
You obviously know all about this sort of thing. Could you tell us what's going on? We're terribly ignorant about horse racing.
It isn't racing, it's jumping, said Aunt Margery, not looking round.
Oh,
said the youngest of the three girls.
Oh, I see.
Haven't you been to a show before? Liz asked kindly.
No,
chorused the girls, and this was true. There were no shows and very few gymkhanas at the bottom of the River Rhine, where these three girls, the Rhine daughters, Flosshilde, Welgund and Woglind, had spent the last 2,000 years. They have trout races, but that's not quite the same. Well, said Aunt Margery patiently, as if explaining to a Trobriand islander how to use a fork, the idea is to make the horse jump over all the obstacles.
Why?
asked Flosshilde. Woglind scowled at her.
Because if you don't, you get faults,
said Aunt Margery.
And if you get more faults than everybody else, you lose.
That explains a great deal, said Flosshilde brightly. Thank you.
Mr. Philip Wilcox on Mayfair, said the tannoy.
Aunt Margery turned to the Rhine maidens, who were amusing themselves by making atrocious puns on the word fault.
Watch this, she urged them. He's very good.
The Rhine daughters put on their most serious expressions, which were not very serious in absolute terms, and paid the strictest attention as Philip Wilcox and his tired but determined horse entered the ring. As the horse went past her, Flosshilde suddenly started forward, but Welgund nudged her and she composed herself.
You see, said Aunt Margery, he's building up his speed nicely. He's timed it just right, and oh!
Why has he stopped? asked Woglind. I thought you said he was going to jump over that fence thing. Aunt Margery, raising her voice above the gasps and whispers of the spectators, explained that it was called a refusal. Does he lose marks for that?
Yes,
said Liz crisply.
He's still got points in hand, said
Aunt Margery, trying to stay calm in this crisis. I expect he'll go round the other way now. Yes, I thought he would. He stopped again, said Woglind. So he has, said Liz. I wonder why. Is he allowed to hit his horse with that stick? asked Flosshilde. It must hurt an awful lot. I think it's cruel, said Welgund.
I think he's going to try the gate this time, said Aunt Margery nervously. Oh dear, not again.
I think it's his fault for hitting the horse with that stick, said Welgund. If I was the horse, I'd throw him off.
33 faults, sniggered the tannoy.
Is that a lot? asked Flosshilde. Aunt Margery confirmed that it was, rather. Philip Wilcox was obviously finding it hard to think straight through the buzz of malicious giggling that welled up all around him. But the only jump he hadn't tried yet was the water jump. He pulled Mayfair's head round, promising him an apple if he made it, and the glue factory if he didn't, and he pressed with his heels in the approved manner. Mayfair began to move smoothly, rhythmically towards the obstacle.
Come on now,
Aunt Margery hissed under her breath.
Plenty of pace, go on.
There is nothing in the world that amuses human beings more than the sight of a fully grown, fully clothed man falling into water, and sooner or later the human race must come to terms with this fact. But to the Rhine daughters, who are not human but were created by a unique and entirely accidental fusion of the life forces, it seems strange that this unfortunate accident should produce such gales of laughter from everyone present, including the tannoy. Even Welgund, who thought it served him right for hitting the horse with a stick, was moved to compassion. She looked round to see if she was the only person not laughing, and observed that at least the girl sitting next to the fat woman did not seem to be amused. In fact, she appeared to be perfectly calm, and her face was a picture of tranquillity, like some Renaissance Madonna. Perhaps, thought the Rhine daughter, she's an immortal too, or perhaps she's just annoyed.
I'm so glad Joe won in the end, said Liz, getting to her feet. Shall we go and find some tea?
Restored to human shape once more, Malcolm crawled into the house and collapsed into a chair. He was utterly exhausted. His mouth was bruised and swollen, his back and sides were aching, and he'd pulled a muscle in his neck when he'd stopped so suddenly in front of the water jump. The whole thing had probably hurt him as much as it had hurt Philip Wilcox, and he had a terrible feeling that it hadn't been worth it. A minute or so of unbridled malice on his part was probably the worst thing that could happen to the universe, and his original argument that anything that humiliated Philip Wilcox was bound to be good for the world seemed rather flimsy in retrospect. He could only hope that the consequences would not be too dire. With an effort, he rose to his feet and stumbled out into the grounds. The show was, mercifully, drawing to a close, and within an hour or so all the cars that were hiding his grass from the sun would be winding their way home, probably, since this was Somerset, at 15 miles an hour behind a milk tanker. All he had to do now was present the prizes. This would, of course, mean standing up in public and saying something coherent, and for a moment he stopped dead in his tracks. He should be feeling unmitigated terror at the prospect of this ordeal, but he wasn't. He tried to feel frightened, but the expected reaction refused to materialize. He raised his eyebrows and said, "Well, I'm damned," to himself several times. As he stood on the platform handing out rosettes, the 3 Rhine daughters studied him carefully through their designer sunglasses.
"No, don't tell me," whispered Flosshilde. "I'll remember in a minute."
"Siegfried," said Welgund. "It's Siegfried. What a nerve!"
"Why shouldn't he be Siegfried if he wants to?" whispered Wanglind. "I think it suits him."
"Oh, well," Flosshilde shrugged her slim shoulders.
"Here we go again."
Malcolm was shaking Joe Ayres by the hand and saying, "Well done." Joe Ayres winced as he withdrew his hand. He suspected that the German's ferocious grip had dislocated one of his knuckles.
"It could have been worse," said Flosshilde, "considering."
She stopped suddenly and poked Welgund's arm.
"Look," she hissed. "Over there, by the pear tree. Look who it is."
"No!" Welgund's eyes were sparkling with excitement as she followed Flosshilde's pointing finger, and a pear on the tree ripened prematurely as a result.
"I don't believe it."
"He doesn't look a day older," said Wanglind fondly. The other 2 made faces at her. Malcolm recognised Alberich at once. As the Prince of the Nibelungs approached him, Malcolm's heart seemed to collapse. Not that the Nibelung was the terrifying sight. A short, broad, grey man in a dark overcoat. Nothing more. There was no point in running away, and Malcolm stood his ground as Alberich approached and extended his hand for a handshake. Malcolm dosed his fist around the ring and put his hands behind his back. "I'm sorry," said Alberich in German. "I thought you were someone else." "Oh, yes. Someone I used to know in Germany, as a matter of fact. You looked very like him, from a distance, but perhaps he was a little bit taller." "I don't think so," said Malcolm without thinking. Alberich laughed. "How would you know? But you're right. Actually, he wasn't." "My name is Manfred Finger," Malcolm managed to say. "I own the Hall." "Hans Albrecht," Alberich smiled again. "I'm afraid I don't know many people in England, and perhaps you know a friend of mine who lives near here." "I'm afraid I don't know many people either," said Malcolm, forcing himself to smile. "I've only been here a short while myself." "Well, if this friend of mine is a very remarkable person, so perhaps you do know him. Malcolm Fisher. Familiar?" "Any friend of Malcolm's is a friend of mine," said Malcolm truthfully, "but I don't remember him mentioning you." "That's so like him." Alberich was massaging the 4th finger of his right hand as if it was hurting. "Arthritis," he explained. "Anyway, if you see him before I do, you might remind him that he's got something of mine. A gold ring and a hat, both valueless, but I'd like them back." "I'm afraid Malcolm hasn't been quite himself lately," said Malcolm, "but I'll remind him if I see him before you do." "Would you? That's very kind. And do give him my best wishes." Alberich turned to go, and then stopped. "Oh, and by the way," he said in English, "well done. I liked your horse. Goodbye." As if that wasn't bad enough, Malcolm heard on the late news that 2 airliners had missed each other by inches over Manchester that afternoon. Had they collided, said the announcer, more than 500 people would probably have lost their lives. An inquiry was being held, but the probable cause of the incident was human error.